Reggie Lewis blocked Michael Jordan 4 times in one game. 2 years later, doctors gave him opposite answers about his heart. Before anyone could settle who was wrong, Lewis collapsed again and died at 27. 12 specialists had warned that basketball could kill him. Days later, another medical team faced the cameras and described a normal athlete's heart. One body, opposite futures, and the man whose life depended on the answer was expected to choose. How did a high school substitute become the defender who made Michael Jordan hesitate? Why would a warning from 12 specialists sound like just one more verdict Reggie Lewis could defeat? And when Boston's most respected medical minds turned his future into a public argument, who failed him? The answers begin with Jordan. By March of 1991, Michael Jordan had seen defenders reach, grab, shove, double team, and pray. None of it was new. He was marching toward another scoring title, another Most Valuable Player award, and Chicago's first championship. When Jordan rose for a jumper, the safest assumption in basketball was that the defender was already too late. Then Reggie Lewis blocked him. Jordan tried again. Lewis blocked him again. By the time that Sunday afternoon at Boston Garden was over, the quiet man in the green jersey had rejected Michael Jordan 4 times. Not 4 times in a season, not 4 times across a career, 4 times in one double overtime fight. Jordan still scored 37 points because he was Michael Jordan. But he needed 36 shots to get them. Lewis scored 25, hit his first three-pointer of the season to force overtime, and helped Boston win 135-132. Years later, Jordan still remembered exactly what had happened. "He had my number that particular night," Jordan said. "He shocked me a little bit." That should have been the beginning of a rivalry. Jordan was taking control of the NBA. Larry Bird was nearing the end in Boston. Reggie Lewis looked like the man being prepared to stand between them, the long, fearless scorer who could inherit the Celtics and make even the best player alive look over his shoulder. Instead, that night became evidence in a case basketball never got to finish. To understand how Boston's future ended up trapped between doctors, doubt, and a decision that could cost him everything, go back to Baltimore, where the basketball world delivered its first insult to Reggie Lewis and buried him on the bench of perhaps the most talented public high school team America had ever produced. Dunbar High School did not have a normal basketball roster. It had a traffic jam of future professionals. There was Muggsy Bogues, the tiny guard who would make a career out of walking into a league of giants and refusing to be embarrassed. There was Reggie Williams, one of the most celebrated high school players in the country. There was David Wingate, another future NBA player. College recruiters came to Dunbar because they knew the next scholarship could be sitting anywhere in the gym. And Reggie Lewis was not the main attraction. He was barely an attraction at all. He was tall, thin, quiet, and always waiting for somebody else's turn to end. On teams that went 59-0 across his final 2 high school seasons, Lewis was a substitute. The future captain of the Boston Celtics was being told every day in public that 3 other names mattered more. That was not cute trivia. For a teenager who knew what he could become, it was humiliation swallowed in silence. Every practice forced Lewis to confront players who already had bigger reputations. Every game placed him behind names the crowd recognized first. He did not have the ball long enough to build an offense around himself. He could not demand that the gym stop and discover him. He had to make an impression in whatever minutes remained. This became the first fight of his life. Reggie Lewis kept arriving in places where somebody else had already been declared the star. At Dunbar, it was Williams, Wingate, and Bogues. In Boston, it would be Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish. In the Eastern Conference, it would be Michael Jordan. Lewis never solved that problem by becoming louder. He made the people overlooking him regret it. Dunbar's practices were often more competitive than the games. Lewis learned to score against length, speed, and pressure before thousands of fans knew his name. He also learned something less glamorous but just as important. Talent alone did not guarantee attention. On a team that deep, a good week did not make you special. It only earned you another week of trying to prove it. When the famous programs looked at Dunbar, they saw the headliners. Northeastern University saw the quiet player behind them. For Lewis, Northeastern was not basketball royalty. It was better than that. It was an open door. He arrived in Boston still wearing his Dunbar letter jacket so often that his new teammates teased him about it. The school that had buried him on the bench was still written across his back. Lewis carried the insult with him. Whatever the reason, the substitute from Baltimore changed almost immediately once Northeastern handed him the ball. As a freshman, Lewis averaged nearly 18 points. Northeastern won 27 games, the best season in school history at the time. He was not waiting behind 4 future professionals anymore. Now the offense belonged to him, and he treated that responsibility as if he had been saving points for years. He scored in transition. He rose over smaller defenders. He used a first step that seemed too sudden for a player 6'7". On defense, the same arms that would later bother Jordan swallowed passing lanes and turned comfortable jumpers into nervous ones. Northeastern reached the NCAA tournament in each of Lewis's 4 seasons. He finished with more than 2,700 points and became the most prolific scorer the school had ever seen. 3 times he was named his conference's Player of the Year. Yet, even after more than 2,700 points, the basketball establishment found another reason to look past him. Northeastern was not North Carolina. It was not Georgetown. It was not one of the national machines that could turn every good performance into a television event. Lewis could dominate his conference, carry his school into March, and still enter the 1987 NBA draft as a question. The question was no longer whether he could play. The question was whether the league believed what he had done against smaller programs would survive against grown professionals. The NBA passed on Reggie Lewis 21 times. Only then did the Celtics call his name with the 22nd pick. For a local college star, it sounded perfect. He would not have to leave the city that had watched him grow. He was joining the most decorated franchise in basketball. He would learn inside a locker room filled with champions. It looked like a perfect ending. It was the beginning of another disappearance. Boston had won the championship in 1986 and returned to the finals in 1987. Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish were not ceremonial legends yet. They were still playing. Dennis Johnson still controlled the backcourt. Danny Ainge still needed his minutes. The Celtics did not need a young player to discover himself in public. They needed him to sit, learn, and avoid mistakes while veterans chased another banner. There was already a shadow inside the building. 1 year earlier, Boston had drafted Len Bias to extend the dynasty. Bias died before playing a single NBA game. The Celtics had already buried one young future. Now, another young first-round pick walked into the same locker room carrying a future nobody could measure. Boston did not know it yet, but history was preparing a second heartbreak. For the moment, Lewis simply vanished. As a rookie, Reggie Lewis averaged 8.3 minutes and 4.5 points. Boston took a man who had scored more than 2,700 college points and buried him behind its veterans. Entire games passed while Lewis watched from the bench. Had Boston drafted another small college mirage, or was the most decorated franchise in basketball making the same mistake Dunbar had made? Lewis did not answer with a complaint. He waited. Then Larry Bird's body forced Boston to open the door its coaches had kept closed. Early in the 1988-89 season, Bird underwent surgery on both heels and played only 6 games. Boston lost the center of its universe. The Celtics had spent years knowing exactly where the ball should go when a possession became uncomfortable. Suddenly, that answer was sitting in street clothes. Somebody had to take shots. Somebody had to create offense. Somebody had to prove that the franchise still had a future when Bird could not rescue it. Lewis stepped from the edge of the rotation into the starting lineup and destroyed the old argument in one season. He did not merely improve, he exploded from 4.5 points to 18.5. 1 year, Boston barely let him play. The next, it could not survive without him. That was a player escaping a locked room. The same Boston audience that had barely seen him as a rookie now watched him glide past defenders, stop in the middle distance, and release a jumper before the defense could decide whether he was driving. He did not pound the ball to announce his intentions. He made one move, found a seam, and attacked it. He was not Bird. Trying to become Bird would have destroyed him. Bird controlled games with vision, strength, nerve, and the arrogance of a man who often knew the ending before everybody else. Lewis was quieter and quicker. He created uncertainty with his first step and those arms that seemed to arrive at the ball from somewhere outside the shooter's field of vision. Boston had not found another Larry Bird, it had found Reggie Lewis. That mattered because the next ruler of the Eastern Conference was not waiting for another Bird. Michael Jordan was coming. By March 31, 1991, the Chicago Bulls were no longer an entertaining team built around a scoring phenomenon. They were 53-17. Jordan was on his way to his fifth straight scoring title, another Most Valuable Player award, and the first championship of the Bulls dynasty. The old Celtics were still dangerous, especially inside Boston Garden, but the direction of the league was obvious. Bird's back and the mileage on McHale and Parrish were pulling Boston toward the past. Jordan was dragging Chicago into the future. Reggie Lewis stood between those timelines. The game began as a national measuring stick. The aging Celtics still believed they could slow Chicago. Boston's younger players had to survive when Jordan increased the pressure. And if Bird could no longer carry every minute, who would stand in front of the best player in basketball without blinking? Jordan had another weapon beyond the jumper. He talked. He tested opponents before the possession was finished, searching for the insecurity that would make a defender reach, rush, or lose control. Young players often treated the conversation like an invitation. They answered, and Jordan turned their anger into another advantage. Lewis would not play that game. When Jordan tried to pull him into the noise, Lewis smiled and kept moving. Teammates knew that smile. It did not mean he was intimidated. It meant the argument was going to happen through the next possession. That calm could fool people. Lewis did not perform his aggression for the crowd. He saved it for the instant a scorer believed he had created enough separation. Lewis did more than stand there. The first block looked like timing. The second wiped away the excuse. The third made it personal. By the fourth, Jordan was no longer merely surprised. He was irritated, maybe even a little spooked. Lewis had not blocked a center trying an awkward hook. He had invaded Michael Jordan's airspace 4 times in the same game. Jordan later admitted Lewis's length confused him, and Lewis was not finished attacking. That was what impressed Jordan. Lewis did not spend the rest of the afternoon celebrating his defense. He kept attacking. Chicago erased a 14-point fourth-quarter deficit and moved ahead late. 4 blocks would have been enough for the headline. Lewis wanted the ending, too. Boston trailed by 3 with the final seconds disappearing. Lewis had not made a three-pointer all season, not one. But with 19.4 seconds remaining, he caught the ball and made the shot that forced overtime. His first 3 of the season arrived because there was no room left to wait for a safer attempt. The teams needed 2 overtimes. Jordan played 51 minutes. Lewis played 53. Bird scored 34. Scottie Pippen scored 35. Jordan reached 37, but his 12 for 36 shooting line told the real story of the resistance he had faced. Boston won 135-132. Years later, when asked about Lewis, Jordan laughed before answering. He remembered. Great players do not always remember every defender who has a good night against them. They remember the ones who forced them to change the calculation. Jordan would later say Lewis had gotten the better of him that night. That afternoon made Lewis unforgettable to Jordan, and that was rare. Reggie Lewis had faced the ultimate test and made the test uncomfortable. The quiet substitute from Dunbar had made the most famous player in basketball remember his name. Now Boston had to decide what that name could become. The answer came gradually, then all at once. Lewis became Boston's leading scorer. During the 1991-92 season, he averaged 20.8 points and earned his first All-Star selection. The numbers were strong, but they still did not fully explain what the Celtics were asking him to do. Joe Dumars understood the problem better than most. The Detroit guard had built his reputation by defending the league's most dangerous scorers. When asked for his toughest assignment other than Jordan, Dumars chose Lewis. "It was Reggie Lewis for me," Dumars said. "He was a tough cover." Dumars remembered the length, the smooth release, and the way Lewis could rise over a defender without allowing him to turn the matchup into a physical fight. This was no longer one memorable afternoon against Jordan. One of the best defensive guards of the era had reached the same conclusion from the other side of the ball. Bird could still produce brilliant nights, but his body could no longer promise that he would be available tomorrow. McHale and Parrish remained proud, skilled veterans, yet the clock was winning against all of them. Boston was no longer choosing between the old stars and Lewis. The franchise needed both, sometimes within the same game. Lewis had to respect the hierarchy while quietly replacing it. That is a dangerous assignment in a city that hangs its history from the ceiling and weaponizes every comparison. Every time Lewis played well, Boston asked if he was ready to lead. Every time he struggled, the city wondered whether it had crowned the wrong man. The 1992 playoffs supplied the answer that regular season numbers could not. Across 10 playoff games, Lewis averaged 28 points. He shot better than 52%. This was not empty production collected during a lost season. Boston was trying to survive the end of an era, and Lewis became the cleanest source of offense it had. Against Cleveland in the conference semifinals, the burden became obvious. The Cavaliers were younger, deeper, and built to punish an aging team over 7 games. Lewis scored 36 in Game 3. In Game 4, he scored 42. 42 points in a playoff game, while Bird, McHale, and Parrish were still wearing Celtics uniformes. That was the transfer of power happening in public. Cleveland ended Boston's season in 7 games, but the transfer of power was complete. Lewis averaged more than 28 points while making nearly 55% of his shots. The apprentice was gone. In the biggest games, Larry Bird's Celtics were surviving because of Reggie Lewis. Then Larry Bird retired. For 13 years, Bird had been more than Boston's best player. He had been the team's voice, nerve, identity, and emergency plan. When an entire possession collapsed, the Celtics could hand him the problem. When the building became nervous, Bird often seemed insulted by the idea that anybody else might decide the game. There was no replacing that, but a captain still had to be named. The Celtics chose Reggie Lewis. Bird did not need a long speech to explain why. He was a gamer, Bird said. Bird had watched Lewis arrive as a raw scorer who did not yet understand every layer of the professional game. He had also watched him stay in the gym, expand his game, and turn patience into authority. The captaincy was not a gift passed from one famous name to another. Lewis had taken the long route to earn it. From Dunbar's bench to Larry Bird's captaincy, the distance was enormous. As an NBA rookie, Lewis had averaged fewer than 9 minutes. Now Boston was placing the franchise in his hands. Boston was not giving him a ceremonial title. The 1992-93 Celtics belonged to Lewis because they had nowhere else to go. He led them in scoring again at 20.8 points per game. His role expanded. His assists increased. The offense moved through him. The famous front court was disappearing one body at a time, and Lewis was expected to keep the franchise respectable while the rest of the league watched for the collapse. There was also a larger question hanging over the Eastern Conference. Jordan's Bulls had won back-to-back championships. Every team in the East was searching for a player or a system that could make Chicago uncomfortable. The Knicks tried force. Cleveland tried balance. Detroit's old resistance was fading. Boston had a 6'7" wing with a long first step, a reliable middle-distance jumper, and the defensive reach to bother Jordan's release. Could Lewis become the next great obstacle in Jordan's conference? Chicago had the championships. Boston had one uncomfortable piece of evidence. Jordan had already admitted Lewis bothered him, and Lewis was still getting better. The 4 blocks showed the defensive ceiling, The 28-point playoff run showed the offensive burden he could carry. The captaincy showed what Boston believed. The evidence was already on tape. Then came April 29, 1993. The Celtics opened the playoffs at Boston Garden against the Charlotte Hornets. It was a dangerous matchup wrapped in a familiar face. Charlotte's point guard was Muggsy Bogues, Lewis's old Dunbar teammate, the tiny floor general who had once started while Lewis waited on the high school bench. Now Lewis was captain of the Celtics, and for the first few minutes, he looked determined to end the game by himself. Boston scored 12 early points. Lewis had 10 of them. He attacked from the opening tip. He made 7 of his 11 shots. Charlotte had no comfortable answer, and the Garden could feel its captain taking control. No one inside Boston Garden knew it, but Reggie Lewis had 13 NBA minutes left. Then, 6 minutes into the game, Lewis turned to run back on defense. There was no collision, no defender knocked him down, no ankle rolled under another player's foot. Lewis stumbled and fell to the parquet. For a few seconds, the entire meaning of the game changed. He remained on the parquet, looking dazed. Teammates and staff gathered around him. The crowd watched the player who had appeared unstoppable moments earlier try to understand why his own body had suddenly refused the next step. Then Lewis stood up, and the building accepted the answer it wanted. Some around the team believed he might have bumped his head, but there had been no collision. Lewis had simply fallen, and Boston still allowed its captain to return twice. The dizziness remained, so did the shortness of breath. Eventually, the game could no longer pretend that everything was normal. His final line was 17 points in 13 minutes. 17 points in 13 minutes. That sounds like the beginning of a great playoff performance. It became the last NBA box score of his life. Boston won Game 1, 112-101. Without Lewis, the Celtics lost the next 3 and the series. Alonzo Mourning ended Game 4 with a shot at the buzzer, closing not only Boston's season, but the final chapter of the Bird-McHale-Parrish era. McHale retired after the loss, but the basketball result had already become secondary. Before doctors began fighting over his heart, one uncomfortable question was already hanging over Boston. Why had a player who collapsed without contact been allowed back into a playoff game twice? The question was no longer whether Reggie Lewis could carry the Celtics. It was what Boston had just watched happen to him. The next morning, Lewis entered New England Baptist Hospital. Doctors ran test after test. The early results did not offer comfort. Several pointed toward a dangerous problem near the lower portion of his heart. The Celtics assembled 12 leading specialists. Newspapers called them a medical dream team. 12 experts were supposed to produce certainty. The specialists met without Lewis or his wife in the room. They reviewed the evidence and delivered a verdict that threatened everything he had built. Focal cardiomyopathy. In plain language, they believed part of his heart muscle was damaged. That damage could produce a lethal rhythm during exertion. The verdict was brutal: stop playing basketball or risk dying. This was the first answer, backed by 12 specialists and the authority of the Celtics medical system. And Reggie Lewis refused to let that answer bury his career. He had spent his life hearing incomplete judgments. High school substitute, small college scorer, 22nd draft pick, NBA bench player. Each verdict had eventually failed. Now another group of experts was telling him there was a limit he could not cross. Was this finally the warning he had to accept, or one more conclusion that would collapse if somebody looked again? Lewis and his wife, Donna, felt shut out of the process. 12 specialists had discussed his life without them in the room. Then Celtics executives left for the team's next playoff game without even speaking to the couple. In the middle of the night, Boston's captain did something that looked less like a hospital transfer than an escape. Lewis disconnected the monitors, signed his own release, and slipped through a side entrance. A security vehicle from Brigham and Women's Hospital was already waiting a few blocks away. He was abandoning the hospital connected to his team and placing his future in the hands of a rival medical group. Across town, Dr. Gilbert Mudge and his colleagues reviewed Lewis's case. They repeated tests and added others. Where the first group saw evidence of damaged heart muscle and feared a dangerous rhythm, Mudge's group believed Lewis could be experiencing a very different condition, a fainting response controlled by the nervous system. The distinction was enormous. One diagnosis could end his career, the other might be managed. On May 10th, Mudge stepped before television cameras and delivered the exact opposite message. Lewis, he said, had a normal athlete's heart, and a return to professional basketball might be possible under medical supervision. Lewis sat beside his wife and looked relieved. "I'm just glad it's finally come to an end," he said. But it hadn't come to an end. 12 specialists had warned that basketball could kill him. Days later, another respected medical team told the city it might be safe to hope again. Those answers could not both be right. Lewis had to decide which future to trust, and he would carry every bit of the risk if that choice was wrong. In one future, Reggie Lewis was finished with basketball, but alive. In the other, treatment and supervision might return him to the Celtics. Which answer would you trust if the game had carried you from a high school bench to the captaincy of Boston, and both versions came from people with impressive titles, advanced equipment, and absolute confidence? The dispute exploded beyond the hospitals. Doctors attacked one another's methods. Reporters compared tests they were not trained to interpret. Celtics fans celebrated while the original medical team remained alarmed. Even the New England Journal of Medicine entered the fight. This was no longer a private diagnosis. Boston was watching prestigious institutions examine one body and sell the city opposite futures. Lewis wanted certainty. Instead, he got noise. So he sought a third opinion. Then California made everything worse. In June, 4 specialists in Southern California examined Lewis. The third opinion refused to declare a winner. The third group did not fully confirm the first diagnosis. It did not fully confirm the second. The doctors found a distinct abnormality in the same area that had frightened the original team. But after a week of testing, they still could not determine whether it represented a life-threatening disorder or the less dangerous fainting condition proposed in Boston. They wanted more evidence. They wanted Lewis's heart monitored while he performed competitive basketball activity. They believed a controlled, conditional return might eventually be possible, but not before they could observe what happened under the kind of pressure that had triggered the first collapse. Lewis's agent called the situation a crossfire of opinions. That phrase may be the most honest diagnosis anyone gave him. By then, nearly 24 doctors had participated in his evaluation. Every hospital had a reputation. Every specialist had a title. Reggie Lewis had the risk. He did not have one answer. He had a warning, a reassurance, and an unresolved third opinion. The man who had always beaten doubt with repetition finally faced a problem repetition could not solve. If a coach questioned his jumper, Lewis could take another 1,000 shots. If a defender challenged his first step, he could attack again. If Michael Jordan rose for another jumper, Lewis could try to block it. But how do you practice against uncertainty inside your own body? Lewis did what he had done whenever basketball placed another barrier in front of him. He kept working. While Lewis waited for another monitored test, the work became smaller. A stationary bicycle, quiet shooting sessions, nothing close to an NBA return. And movement mattered to Reggie Lewis. Since the playoff collapse, his life had been controlled by machines, meetings, test results, and arguments between men in white coats. On a basketball court, the language was simpler. The ball either went in or it did not. The body moved or it did not. The work produced an answer. At least, that was how basketball had always worked before. For nearly 3 months, doctors had argued about what might happen. On July 27th, the argument ran out of time. That afternoon, Lewis went to a gym at Brandeis University for a light unofficial workout. There was no playoff crowd, no national television audience, no Michael Jordan attacking the rim, no Garden noise rolling down from the balcony, just a quiet court and a 27-year-old man shooting baskets. He was trying to take another step. Then Reggie Lewis collapsed again. This time, he did not get back up and return to the game. The man who had been told that his career might be over, then told that his heart looked like a normal athlete's heart, was gone before the argument could produce a final answer. Reggie Lewis died at 27 years old. And every answer from the previous 3 months suddenly looked like part of an accusation. Suspicion spread in every direction, to the specialists who warned him, the doctors who reassured him, the Celtics system that allowed him back into the playoff game twice, and a medical world that handed one man 3 different futures. Who had failed Reggie Lewis? One group said his career had to end. Another said the danger might be managed. A third found an abnormality and still could not say what it meant. One body, opposite answers, and no time left to settle the fight. Early findings after his death pointed to inflammation in the heart muscle, but the arguments did not end. Doctors fought, lawyers followed. Boston kept asking whether this could have been stopped. That question followed the same pattern as Lewis's entire career. At Dunbar, the depth chart called him a bench player. At Northeastern, the national basketball establishment looked elsewhere. In Boston, his rookie minutes suggested he might disappear. Every time, Lewis worked until the verdict changed. Then that instinct met a warning that could not be defeated with more shots, more conditioning, or another great game. The experts had turned medicine into a bet. Reggie Lewis was the only man putting his life on the table. Which future would you have chosen? The one that ended everything immediately, or the one that sounded like every other obstacle Lewis had already overcome? The news moved through Boston with terrifying speed. The Celtics had lost the player they planned to build around. The city had lost the man behind the uniform. Around Roxbury and the neighborhoods where Boston's black community knew him best, people remembered more than a scorer. Lewis visited schools, supported youth programs, and appeared in places where national cameras never followed him. During the holidays, he and his family helped provide food to people who needed it. In a city with a painful racial history, Reggie Lewis was a black Celtics captain who belonged to the community beyond the Garden walls. That was why the mourning could not be contained inside basketball. Thousands filed through Matthews Arena at Northeastern to say goodbye. More than 7,000 attended the funeral service. Former teammates, coaches, city leaders, ordinary fans, and families who remembered what Lewis had done away from the scoreboard filled the building. His wife had lost her husband. His children had lost their father. Northeastern had lost the player who carried it to 4 straight NCAA tournaments. Boston had lost its captain only 1 year after handing him the franchise. And the NBA had lost a matchup it never got to finish. Michael Jordan was not finished in 1993. He was reaching the height of his power. The Bulls had won 3 consecutive championships, Bird had retired, and Boston's best hope of remaining in the Eastern Conference argument was the quiet captain with the long arms and the mid-range jumper. Lewis had already shown that he could stand in front of Jordan without shrinking. March 31, 1991, 4 blocks in 1 game. Jordan needed 36 shots. Lewis kept coming. When Boston needed a basket to survive, the man who had not made a 3-pointer all season stepped behind the line and buried one. Then the Celtics won. Years later, Jordan still said Lewis had gotten the better of him that night. Lewis never received enough years to collect Jordan's trophies or build that kind of resume. What he left was the memory of the most feared scorer in basketball looking across the floor and finding an opponent who would not go away. The Celtics retired number 35. It hangs in Boston as a monument to what Reggie Lewis accomplished and everything nobody got to see. The next playoff duel with Jordan, the next All-Star season, the years as captain, the player he might have become once the Celtics truly belonged to him. But the cruelest missing answer is not how many points Lewis would have scored. It is whether the ending was already written on the night he collapsed against Charlotte, or whether somewhere inside those conflicting tests and opinions there was still a path that could have kept him alive. Doctors gave Reggie Lewis opposite answers. Michael Jordan had already given the basketball world one clear answer. Reggie Lewis belonged on that stage. He had proved it 4 times in 1 game. What nobody could tell him was whether he would survive long enough to stay there.